Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is Journal of the American Revolution contributor Gabriel Neville, and he'll be discussing the Northwest Territory and Virginia's long quest to obtain it. Gabe, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Brady. I'm really delighted to be back and see you again.
Gabe, you've been on the show before. Remind us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I'm 58 years old, which means I was 8 years old during the bicentennial. I grew up a long bike ride from Valley Forge. So when I was young and impressionable, I was surrounded by Revolutionary War stuff and never lost the interest. In fact, it kind of morphed into an addiction. So that's who I am. I'm an addict.
Gabe, this article we're going to be talking about tonight. Your latest article is one of three, so we're going to kind of cover them all. It's this great, big, broad topic, certainly deserving of that amount of time. What made you interested in writing this article?
Well, I wrote this book on the 8th Virginia Regiment, which is the Virginia's Western regiment. It's a bit of an overstatement to call it a frontier regiment, though about half of the companies were, the extreme west. But so the frontier matters to them in the beginning of the story and even before the war. But as you know from your own research, I'm sure, Brady, one of the best sources for these guys after the war is their pension statements. And I haven't calculated, but 75% of them are include depositions taken in Woodford County, Kentucky, or Clark County, Indiana. So why are all these Revolutionary War veterans out west? I wanted to know, and the way I approached my book, I started when the soldiers were kids and finished when they were old men. So it was actually part of the narrative. So I needed to know. That's what got me interested.
Gabe, for some perspective, we focus on Virginia in these articles. How did Virginians in colonial America and revolutionary America view the West? What did that word mean to them?
Well, it depends on how far back you go. If you go back to the very beginning, the definition of Virginia was North America, right? Exclusive of Florida, right? I mean, John Smith literally described it that way. So, more realistically, by the late colonial era, Virginia is everything north of the northern North Carolina line, which included Tennessee then. Sorry for my scratchy throat here. And east of the Mississippi. So that includes a third of Minnesota. Now, that was sort of its charter boundaries. So that was the extent of Virginia according to, King James the First. Governance of territory or ownership of territory could be defined in different ways, and that was what Virginia's charter said. Actually, its charter said it went. Virginia extends to the South Sea, which is the Pacific. That wasn't realistic, but Minnesota was realistic. But then you also had occupancy rights, right? So this is dictated by treaty, Indian treaty. So, for instance, after the French and Indian War, Virginia was technically capable of exercising its chartered rights to all the land to the Mississippi, including the eastern third of Minnesota. But the king issued his famous proclamation in 1763 saying you may not settle west of the Allegheny Ridge. There also was a 1768 treaty that we might speak about more at Fort Stanwix that agreed that the Ohio River west to the Kentucky River was the western or northwestern boundary for Virginia white Anglo settlement, meaning that anything on the other side of the Ohio River was still in Indian land. And it was illegal to settle there. In fact, it was a felony under Virginia law to try to settle there. So there's different ways to define it, but everybody wanted to go west. Wealthy Virginians wanted to speculate in land in the West. That's where the available good land was. And immigrants from Northern Ireland or from southwestern Germany who came here from countries where they really had no prospects of really being landowners, they knew there was land in the West that was available and they wanted it. That's how you became self-sufficient. As I say in my article, there were no banks and there was no stock market in America back then. The only form of durable wealth was land, and everybody wanted it. That's how you made something of yourself. So,
yeah, Gabe, in your first article, you talk about some of the steps Virginia took, I think, with some great forethought, knowing maybe what was coming, or certainly westward movement was on its way. They took some steps to lay claim to a lot of this land. And it was kind of a multifaceted approach. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's complicated. So I already talked about the treaties. And there were a few of them. There were treaties with the Iroquois that governed Kentucky. There were actually two treaties with the Cherokee that governed the same land. The tribes that were most closely proximate, the Shawnee and the Delaware, were not really party to those treaties. Brady, you're the expert on this, so I hesitate to tell you how this worked, but the Iroquois claimed suzerainty over those tribes. They owned the land, and the Shawnee and the Delaware were sort of tenants, and so they sold lots of it to. I actually don't remember, but I guess to Pennsylvania and Virginia. Maybe you can correct me on that. And that opened up more land for settlement. So in English legal philosophy, what they called wasteland or unsettled land, or what we would now say undeveloped land, that was unoccupied, meaning nobody had a house on it, was freely available if there was no local government to sort of administer the process. So Jefferson wrote about this. Others wrote about this. If you went far enough west that there was no county government, no local government, nobody else there, no visible development, you could just take it. It was yours. And this was believed to be sort of a right of nature. And they would grandly go back to the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England, to cite precedents. And they made a big deal about this. And so Virginia, in the 1770s, granted what were called preemption warrants or preemption claims to people who had done this. They were limited, though. You couldn't claim more than a certain amount of acreage. You had to have gone there before a certain date. But if you did that, you got to keep your land. If you came after that date, you could buy land with what was called a treasury warrant. And then what I think we're going to spend some time talking about here, during the war, after the French and Indian War and after the Revolutionary War, they gave military land warrants, bounty land warrants. And these, of course, went to veterans, calculated by length of service and by rank. And you could get land that way too. Yeah.
Gabe, when you're reading over a lot of these notes, who are the names you're always coming across? Who are the Virginians that seem to be the most Western focused? We'll put that politely. Land hungry, maybe otherwise. Of everyone you see, who should the reader know kind of fits into that group?
Well, the sort of obvious answer is George Washington, right? I mean, he has William Crawford go out there almost immediately after the Treaty of Fort Stanwix to survey for him. These are not official surveys. It's more like scouting out the best land, Those surveys aren't done until 1774. But Washington's intensely interested in this. Interestingly, though, at the end of the Revolutionary War, he gets no bounty land, which is kind of cool and interesting. He's the only Virginia general who does not. You also see names like Patrick Henry and Hugh Mercer. These are all veterans of the French and Indian War, or people who bought the warrants from veterans of the French and Indian War, and they get their land surveyed in 1774. Just as Dunmore's War is brewing, and some of the surveyors don't make it back alive. I've got that story in one of the articles. So that and they followed the rules, technically. But for every George Washington and Patrick Henry, you've got many, many, many more former peasants from Europe who are just trying to stake a claim and have some land that they can call their own. And they're generally faceless, but there are many, many more of them.
Yeah, Gabe, one of the things I did like in your article, which you mentioned, was, surveying is difficult enough, but traveling west and trying to exercise an effective survey wasn't always that easy. There were all these other conditions that they had to be mindful of. Tell us a little bit about the challenge of completing these surveys in the frontier.
So when you get your warrant, and there were, I guess, 3 different kinds. There were preemption claims, treasury warrants, and bounty land warrants for veterans. So what that was, it said something in the order of, Brady Kreitzer gets to pick 100 acres of unclaimed land anywhere in Virginia, right? So, in theory, this could be unclaimed land in Williamsburg. There just wasn't any there, right? And Brady wants good land. You don't want just any old land. You want the best land you can find. So this would be land that is, has good soil, and ideally is next to navigable water, right? Maybe close to some settlements so that you can have some neighbors and somewhere to go buy stuff, and that all means west, right? And again, as I said before, it has to be on the correct side of the latest Indian treaty, although people broke the rules frequently. So the steps were if you're a veteran, you have to go to county court and attest to your service with a certificate made out by your officer. So the first step is you go to your officer. If you're an enlisted guy, you need to go find your captain or your colonel and get him to write you a note saying, yes, Brady Kreitzer served in the Revolutionary War for the right amount of time. And then you take that to the county court, any county court, and you attest to your service under oath. And then the county clerk sends a note to the land office in Richmond, and they give you a document that then you can then take out west to have a survey made. You have to be present for it. In fact, you have to provide your own chainman and your own marker. The county surveyor will draw you a little map, and then you, if I remember right, you take it to that county courthouse, and they report annually to the land office, and then you get your deed. So that's a long and complicated and difficult process for a guy who, say, doesn't own a horse, right? So a lot of veterans, they sold their warrants for, pennies on the dollar because they just couldn't go through that process. So yeah, it was difficult.
So, Gabe, in Article 3 of this 3-article set, you mentioned, I think, some really telling quotes from men we've mentioned already: Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Kind of with the Revolution over, the game of moving west is afoot. I always think of it that way. Do you recall what they were talking about, what their strategies were?
Yeah, so I have a couple of little sections, one on Jefferson, one on Washington. Jefferson, being the way Jefferson was, he was, high-minded and philosophical about it. He was very focused on building agrarian republics, and dispersing power and cultivating, a yeoman farmer civilization. So even though he was from Virginia, he was drawing maps early in the war that were chopping Virginia up into multiple new states, which he said should be independent of Virginia and to every other nation in the world. And he even made up names for them with names like Saratoga, which would have honored the great American victory. Metropotamia, I have no idea what that was supposed to mean, but and some even more outlandish names. He of course was in the Continental Congress to draft the Declaration of Independence, but then left and didn't return to the Continental Congress until 1784. And he was one of the members of the Virginia delegation that signed off on the cession of the Trans-Ohio lands. So all that land that we talked about early on the far side of the Ohio, Virginia gave away. They gave it to Congress to create new states as Jefferson had wanted to do. He was a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of Virginia giving its land away. He thought Virginia was too big to govern in a democratic fashion. He thought for a population so large and diverse, governance would ultimately have to result in, I don't think he used the word tyranny, but excessively strong centralized government. Small republics, more like city-states, would be less diverse and therefore easier to govern. So that's what he was focused on. And he in what is called the Land Ordinance of 1784, which he took the lead on too, which did not have the force of law. He was the one who devised the system that we used all the way through to, I guess, Oklahoma, where you had territorial governments first that could then organize themselves as states. So he was important in the early part of that. Then of course he had an important role to play in Western settlement as president too. Washington was more focused on immediate practical matters. How are we going to govern this territory now? How are we going to prevent another war from starting? And how are we going to stop squatters from crossing the river and settling illegally? And he wrote a letter to, I forget his name, but the guy that chaired the Committee of the States in Congress. So this was the committee that basically was the continental. They stood in for Congress when Congress was not in session. So he was an important guy, a fellow Virginian. I forget his name, but Washington writes to him and says, "Look, okay, so we now own all this land. England has ceded it by treaty. We have taken it from the Indians by right of conquest. We have the right to just go take it, right? And this is long established European legal convention. If you fight a just war, particularly one that you didn't start or you were fighting it to protect your rights, at the end of it, any land that you take is yours." Indians had recognized sort of a version of this, right? The Iroquois had relocated the Shawnee and other tribes after their territorial conquests as well. England famously relocated the Acadians during the French and Indian War. So there was long established precedent for taking territory after war and just clearing it out and saying, these guys who lived here before, you got to go. And Washington was very clear, saying, look, we're not going to do that in this case. Those tribes that fought against us in the war, and not all tribes did, but those tribes that fought against us in the war, they chose to fight. We warned them that they were on the wrong team, but they decided to side with Britain, and they lost. So sorry, but we don't owe you anything, and we're going to take half of your land. We're not going to take all of it. It's our right to send you up to Canada, where all the loyalists are presently heading, but we're not going to do that. You can keep, I don't know what the proportions are, but, a significant amount of your land. And he insisted that there be treaties with each tribe that made that case, drew clear boundaries and made it very clear that white settlement could not cross that boundary, that stipulated that squatters who did cross those boundaries could be punished any way that the tribe wanted to, which presumably included execution, which happened. And if the boundaries stretched farther than the Indians thought they ought to, Washington said we should pay them to make up the difference. So I think we look backward and think that all of this was very unjust, but at least on a certain level, that's no different than what happened on the deck of the battleship Missouri at the end of World War II. Right, the Japanese lost. Sorry, we're dictating terms. And we're going to let you keep your emperor. Right? There's a lot to be said about Indian treaties, but it is notable that the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras got to keep their land because they had sided with the colonies, breaking with their Iroquois brethren, which is, it's pretty notable, I think.
Yeah, Gabe, whenever we see the 1780s, and really into the 1790s, but really in that 1780s wheelhouse, Congress has got a serious amount of problems. One of them is debt. Western lands kind of emerged like a great gift for them to deal with this issue of debt, because it's land to be sold with, really, it's essentially all windfall for them. Could you talk about how these lands played into Congress's plans?
Yeah. So I'm going to rewind to what I said earlier about there being no banks and no stock market in America. Right. The only form of durable wealth was land. There was printed money, but the continental dollar was not worth much. And yes, not all of the colonies, most of the colonies were in serious debt, had no real prospect of paying it back. Under the Constitution, the new federal government was deeply in debt. Hamilton, as you know, insisted on assuming the state's debt and paying them off in order to establish the new nation on a firm financial footing. So land was the only thing of real value that we had. And during the war, this might be wading in too deep, but the Articles of Confederation were hard to negotiate because the states that didn't have Western land were concerned that big states like Virginia would dominate. So that Virginia had to agree to cede its Western lands, or much of their Western lands, in order to get the Articles of Confederation done. So that's some backstory. But so then, yes, after the war, Virginia gives the Northwest Territory to Congress. Which is just, I think it's 8 states now. It's just an immense amount of land. And much of it is used to reward veterans from all of the states, or most of the states, by Congress. And the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Land Ordinance of 1787 govern how that land is distributed. And it's Congress is very intent on raising money that way. I don't know what the math is, but it worked, and they raised a substantial amount of money that way.
So, Gabe, you did a real deep dive into the Northwest Territory, Virginia's pursuit of it. And this is the question we always end with, we always have. How do you think this article helps us understand the Revolutionary Era better?
Yeah, this narrative is a bridge between the world we live in and the world that the founders lived in. I think for a lot of us, the founding fathers seem like another species of creature, right? They powder their hair and they wear breeches and they own slaves, and there are all these things that sort of separate them from any world that we recognize. And early colonists hugged the coast and did all their commerce with the old world, and the frontier was a scary place that you didn't go. So these veterans and some folks before them, notably Swedes and Scotch Irish, they were the ones who went west, and there is a clear through line from that all the way up to modern cowboy movies, right? I mean, there's a Western culture in America that we used to be very proud of. We used to talk about cowboy diplomacy, and I mean, the West, as much as anything else, defined American culture for a long, long time, and this is the origin of that culture. This is when you start to get your Conestoga wagons and your families of immigrants, and then you get the Oregon Trail, and this is when all that process began. So in a way, this is when the America we know best started.
Absolutely. Well, Gabe Neville, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here, Brady. Thank you.